that was really great, and I'm happy that we can continue in a similar manner with another great speaker. So when I talked with him about the intro, and I thought like the coolest thing which I found about him online is that he started to code when he was 10. But he told me that it's more important for this audience, it's more relevant that he managed to start and sell for companies, which is a similar extraordinary feat. So I think very few people manage to be like a serial entrepreneur and 4 times start a company, 4 times sell a company. So that is like truly impressive. And please welcome Peter Yared on stage. And while he's setting up, I'm for good reason keeping a little bit of distance, because I know that he's also practicing my Thai boxing, so that's why I'm not going too close to Peter. But I think we'll hear a lot more from Peter on the technology side, and especially on the debate which is currently going on, which a lot of you might be familiar with containers and how they're going to take over the world from anything else that's been here before. So if we get the technology sorted out. See, that's what happens when you want to bring your own laptop. Okay, and we're all set to go. So hope nothing embarrassing pops up. Okay.
Good work.
Thank you very much, Peter, for coming here. The stage is all yours. Give him a big hand of applause.
Thanks everybody for having me here. It's such great energy at this conference. My third visit to Cluj for my first time in Pennsylvania, so it's really an honor to be able to present here. And today we want to talk a little bit about containers. I'm sure you guys have heard about Docker containers or have used them. Well, who's heard of them? Containers. That's quite a few. Who's using them? We have a few. But this is more of a tech trend of where these are going. And you know, my last job before this startup, I was with a television network called CBS, which you may or may not have heard of, but it's a big media company in the United States. And my job was to basically re-platform everything. And they had a bunch of very old systems, you know, mainly from somewhere even from the .com era. And we basically ripped and replaced all the systems, you know, the web analytics, the order management, you know, everything down to the conference room systems, and even the CMS systems. And our impression was, you know, once we brought people new, modern software, they were all going to be very happy and productive. But what we found out was they weren't. And, you know, we went and looked, and basically, if you take screenshots of like Siebel to Salesforce, or PeopleSoft to Workday, you know, a lot of the software, the SaaS systems, are basically exactly the way they were before. So nothing's really changed. The workflows are the same. You know, the software functions the same. You know, what's changed is that the software comes to you automatically. You know, you don't have to upgrade it yourself. You don't have to manage it yourself. When, you know, Salesforce adds a feature for me, you guys all get it. When Salesforce adds a feature for you guys, I get it. However, you know, SaaS has its challenges, you know. You have to, you know, there's this theory that, you know, you only pay for what you use, but I will tell you, you know, being the CIO at a big company, whenever we did a deal with a SaaS company, they were large, multi-year contracts, you know, where we had things like named users. And really, you know, from the financial perspective, it was exactly the same as buying on-premise software. You would make these big upfront commitments, at least from a cash perspective or contract amount. And the big difference, though, and you know, this might be confusing for the non-finance types, but there's 2 types of money really at companies. There's a capital expenditure and an operating expense. And you can take your CapEx, it doesn't affect earnings, which, you know, a lot of companies, especially in the US, are rated by what's called EBITDA, the earnings before interest, tax, and depreciation. So you used to be able to buy software and depreciate it, and it didn't impact your earnings. But the minute you're buying something that's SaaS, guess what? You're renting it, and it hits your operating expense, which, you know, financial people don't like. And the other problem is you don't get your control of your data. These APIs are really painful. A lot of companies charge you to access your own data. And I mean, I will name the culprits. Salesforce charges you to access your own data. Omniture charges you to access your own data. I mean, it's really, really painful. And this thing about multi-tenant, having all of us sharing data at one place, you know, it's good for the vendor. It's not necessarily good for the customer. So So what can we do instead? And this is where containers are kind of exciting, right? You can take your containers, you run them in your data center, you pick your private cloud to run them in. You don't have to deal with an operating system. You know, your workflow is managed if you're building your own stuff between development stage and production, and it's getting to be pretty widely adopted, you know, at all the big cloud vendors, ranging from Amazon to Google. Azure keeps threatening that they're going to ship their alpha. But the really thing, when you step back and you go, how are things going to change? And right now, when you buy software, you're buying stuff in a bunch of different clouds. They're all little puddles. You buy Salesforce, you buy Workday, you buy Google Analytics. These are all different in all different little clouds that don't really communicate with each other. And the way we see things is, in the near future, you're going to have one cloud. It can run on-premise, or you can rent it from Amazon and have a virtual private cloud. You can rent it from Microsoft and have a virtual private cloud there, or at Google. And then you're going to say, okay, I want to run a CRM, I want to run a customer ticketing system, I want to run a finance system. Well, those are all containers that are going to run in your cloud, and you're going to own the data. And the vendors, you can give them the right to update the app containers. And this is a fundamental shift in how we're going to do computing. And I kind of see a lot of younger people here who've never experienced a world, you know, other than SaaS and cloud, you know, as we now know it. But let me tell you, there was a day when you would buy applications and you would run them yourself, you know, and you could depreciate the cost, and you had full access to the data, and you had full transparency into the operating costs. The problem was, you would hack that stuff and it would just calcify in place, and you'd never want to upgrade. And the beauty of things like Kubernetes and Swarm, and, you know, Mark told from Ubuntu was something about something called Juju, which sounds even better than these two. You know, they make it very, very easy to deploy. And it used to be incredibly challenging. If you say, like, even like our software at Sapho, if we say, look, we want to get, you know, 2 Tomcats with a load balancer going to a MySQL with a slave, you know, with this type of backup regimen, you know, literally, it can be a nightmare to deploy stuff like that. And Kubernetes, you know, does it to some extent. Swarm 2 will do it to some extent. But, you know, this is technology that's becoming very, very available and accessible that makes it simple to deploy complicated software. And you got to consider the difference between how things were and where they're going. So it used to be that if you had on-premise software, you as a customer, on your own machines, you'd walk over and you'd have a rack of systems, and you would manage the app from the vendor, the app metadata, and the data. So you would run, let's say, a CRM system like Siebel. You would configure it, that would be the app metadata, and then the data would run right there in your data center. And with SaaS, we moved all of that to the cloud. So the vendor now controls your app, the app metadata, and the data itself. And if you look at where we're going with containers as a service, the vendor can still manage the app, the vendor can still manage the app metadata, but you own the data. And this is what's really nice about this environment. And when you do a kind of a compare and contrast of where things have gone over time, the location is really, you know, the thing that people were really fixated on. But there was a bunch of other pros and cons to these. And the thing about SaaS is it had a lot of cons. But at the time, they overweighed the pain of having to run your own software. But when you can deploy to a private cloud, and you have the ease of scaling, like when you deploy to, you know, let's say Amazon Beanstalk with RDS, or to Amazon Lambda, you don't have to concern yourself with scaling anymore, you know? And you let the vendor update it automatically for you by giving them your keys. What do you get? Well, you get to control your security, you get direct single sign-on, you don't need to federate it, you own your own data, you have direct integration between systems. The accounting is of your choice, so whatever works best for your CFO. And it's single tenant. Your app, you're the only one running it. This is, trust me, much more efficient. So, how does this work from a hybrid perspective? So a lot of companies still have big data centers. And all of these clouds let you backhaul now into your data center with IPsec. And so this is a very common deployment. We did it ourselves at CBS. And so what this lets you do is deploy your software. So if you're a vendor and you're shipping a new version of a CRM, a lightweight, ticketing system, anything, you can deploy it as a container in Amazon or Google, and the customer can then log back into their core systems. So they can pull data, they can interact back and forth. You can log in directly through a Active Directory or an LDAP that's on premises. And what's interesting is when the clients connect through to the system, you can enforce that it happens through the VPN or on network. So you can have software that's never exposed. This is actually a very, very interesting transition. We had a talk earlier today about just the security threats that are out there. I mean, they are just insurmountable. And it's more and more important to just lock your data down and control it yourself. Now, another interesting shift that's happening is this concept where if you're building apps or some type of application, what you can focus on is writing just functions that are relatively stateless and persisting through to persistent data source. And so one example of this would be program your functions in Amazon Lambda, open them up through API Gateway, and then persist all the data in DynamoDB. And this is increasingly the preferred pattern with which for a startup to build new tech. Because it's easy. I mean, they call it serverless, but there are servers, but you're not really exposed to them. Your software scales. At some point, yes, Amazon will get too expensive, and this is where we get to Swarm 2 and micro-containers. So at places like Docker, they're working on very quickly spinning up a container that just does one little thing. They spin them up in microseconds. So this is an architecture that will scale through to a data center, which is actually a very, very kind of interesting point, because when the apps are built like this, they can mix and match with each other. So that perspective, if I could just loop back to it, where once everything's in a cloud together, and you have a microservice interface to, let's say, payment or analytics or something, these apps can start to play with each other, because they're all co-located in the same cloud. They all have the same persistence layer. I hope this isn't getting too geeky for you guys in this story, and it's making sense. So let's talk about the near future here. Instead of buying SaaS, and this is especially for a startup, like when you talk to venture capitalists, there are no opportunities left in SaaS anymore. This is a 15-year-old technology. I mean, the last decent SaaS deal we've all seen is, one for construction companies or something, right? I mean, it's getting deep into the verticals now. If you're a new company and you're trying to provide something to other companies, like from a B2B perspective, seriously think about providing an API or a turnkey service that they can deploy on their own using these new technologies. Just a much, much more novel way to differentiate from the competition. And definitely be very keen on understanding what companies want to do when they have a bunch of different applications. I was thinking this is somebody who was a customer of numerous SaaS systems, is I want to be able to copy all of that data into my data warehouse and be able to calculate things and figure out what's going on and gain insight from it. And this became like one of the absolute most challenging things. You go into most companies, and it's just incredibly challenging for them to pull all this data from all their different vendors, try to get a single view of a customer. It's just an absolute nightmare. So, play in the future and not the past. That is, I flew all the way over here, but that's really my only insight to share, right? Is look at how the next architecture is going to be built and play there. And this is aside from your business idea. If you have a better way for salespeople to contact customers, if you have a better way for customers to lodge a complaint with a company, if you have a better way of doing finance or anything, don't build it in the old architecture, because those vendors can just add whatever you did as a feature and just knock you out. But when you're playing in a green field, you have a lot more opportunity. Now, speaking to somebody who's been through a lot of these industry shifts, when you're the only SaaS vendor for expense reporting, you're taking out the past. So think about how to build your apps when you're building them from scratch. Look at microservices, look at containers, and look at single tenant, in these clouds. And with that, I have 5 minutes for Q&A, so I did it perfectly. I hope this all made sense to you guys. Questions? Thoughts? Well, 5 answers.
private cloud compared to cloud? What's the main difference between private cloud and cloud?
That's a very good question. So the question is, what's the difference between cloud and private cloud? So cloud, as you guys know, is a very nebulous term, but generally, when people will say, I'm going to take this to the cloud, they mean they're going to go to a SaaS vendor. And generally, when companies are renting servers, using infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, they secure it in what's called a virtual private cloud. And so at Amazon, for example, most companies, when they're buying instances there, they secure them within a VPC. And then they do a IPsec backhaul back into their own data center if they still have a physical location. So it's the same as having your own hardware, but you don't actually own the machines, and it's a segregated network. So in this context, you know, when I'm saying private cloud, I'm saying like companies, you know, are increasingly shutting down their data centers and moving their own servers to an Amazon, but then they segregate it. But when you're selling software, you can either create your own cloud and try to integrate it in, or you can create something that runs within their existing cloud, their private cloud. And that's really the distinction. Does that make sense? I hope it does.
How do you do it at Sapho?
How do we do it at Sapho? So Sapho, well, I don't mean to go into be a big shameless plug, but what we do is we create software that makes it very easy to integrate a bunch of wacky systems into a feed for employees. So we target companies that have, you know, a lot of legacy infrastructure, so big banks and airlines and retailers are still running mainframes and old systems, but then they also have a very high proportion of employees under 30. So one financial institution, for example, Ally Financial in the US, are running mainframes, and they have a bunch of employees that, you know, 70% of their employee base is under 30 years old. And young people just detest using crappy hardware and software. So what we do is we deploy on-premise or we deploy in private cloud. We connect all of these systems and then we figure out the interesting things in each one and send it to a user. And so from the very beginning, you know, we did not build this as a SaaS system because we knew the first things that people are going to want to put in, you know, via our software is human resources and finance data. You know, if they show up to these companies and be like, hey guys, I have a cloud service and, you know, why don't you copy all your HR and financial data over to me and then I'll send it off to your employees, they're just like, fuck off, right? But instead we have a very different story. We say we will deploy on-premise and connect all this stuff and we'll cache your data locally or we'll run in your private cloud, which from a compliance perspective generally is the same as on-premise nowadays. So it's a much more valid pitch, especially when you're playing with other people's data. Because people are sick of their data getting, you know, stolen. You know, they think Salesforce is secure, or they think Zendesk is secure, but these systems really aren't secure, and then the companies themselves have bad actors inside. That's all your data.
Okay, I got a question.
Yes.
Yeah. Since you're gonna deliver them as a container, these I have a product and I'm gonna deliver it in a container. So install it in your cloud, please. I'm just curious, the whole operational aspect, does that still come for me as the one vending it, or is my customer gonna deal with a lot of operations suddenly?
Yeah.
Because they own that cloud.
So we've had both. So we have some customers that give us the right to update it for them. And then we have other customers that want to do it themselves. Now, for the customers that want to do it themselves that are on-premise, we generally only will work with companies that are capable of dealing with a Java infrastructure or Kubernetes infrastructure, because this is still somewhat nascent. But for people who are in a private cloud, like on Amazon, they'll give us the keys to update just that server, which is actually pretty interesting. Because from their perspective, it's just like SaaS. The software is magically updated for them, but they own their data.
But then they will have the implication that after install my product, it's lightweight. I hope for you, your cloud, because else, so if you create a product that is very heavy for your cloud, I guess customers won't like it either. So
if you have a very fat, processor-intensive product running on the cloud, actually, the customers do prefer it, and let me tell you why. If you're running it in SaaS, you say, hey, you know, it's so hard to run this stuff, so we're going to charge you a lot of money. And they don't have transparency. When it's running on their cloud, they are paying for the cost of running the software, right? And then themselves. They have a bill from Amazon or Google that explains exactly what it costs. You know, if they're in a private data center, they generally have a chargeback system in place, so they know exactly what it costs to run your software, right? And then you charge for the value your software is actually adding. So it's something they actually prefer, believe it or not. And it used to be much more expensive to run it yourself, but you know, now with the scalability of containers and private clouds, it's very transparent.
Okay. Thank you so much for this great talk.
Great to be here.
I really learned a lot from that.